have no idea what the fuck.
Welcome to another episode of I Have No Idea What the Fuck, and today I'm going to talk about freedom. Freedom is a really nebulous, ephemeral term that is used today to evoke positive feelings in those that hear the word. And interesting. Must have not seen that correctly. So I was crossing the street and I don't think I saw the lights turning correctly. But freedom is a term that is used a lot to evoke good feelings in people, but I don't think a lot of people know what freedom is. Freedom is this nebulous, ideal, kind of unattainable thing that people complain for, but never really understand how to get it. And a lot of this discussion is had in the political sphere, and I really would like to contribute something to the human community on this. Because a lot of people talk about it, but I don't think a lot of people know what it is. Freedom is the ability to do whatever the fuck you want to do. That's what it is. Now, you say, well, I knew what that was. Like, I know what freedom is. But when I say that you know what freedom is, I'm talking about, do you live that in your daily life? People say they know what it is. It's like, I can do whatever the fuck I want to do. But can you? Can you really? Like, can you just get up and walk out of your job, no stress at all, knowing that you're confident in who you are and what you want? Can you just stop paying whatever it is that you need to pay and still be able to get around and still be able to do what you want to do and be completely at peace with it? Can you just run through a red light? We say, no, well, we need rules. We need rules. Everybody can't just do exactly what they want to do. Exactly. That's exactly my point. People know what freedom is in theory, but they don't support it in practice. Understand? They don't support it in practice. So therefore, no one actually knows what freedom is. Until you practice freedom, until you actually practice freedom, you can never actually know what it is. So there's so many people that cry for it and scream for it and want it and want individuality and want this and want that, but you will never be free. And yet, now I'm not saying that I support running through red lights. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I support, breaking the statutes, the law, in, certain laws in this world that seem to have a practical application, for people's safety and all that. However, the thing about it is, the thing about this world is it's run by the ego, the sense of self. And the sense of self is a fake reality. You're not the ego. The ego is the sense of self. It's not the self. People think that the ego is the self, but it's just the sense of self. And so when you understand that the ego is only the sense of self, not the self itself, you begin to see that the world operates on this sense of self, and the world operates on the belief that the sense of self is the self. So anyone who operates from the ego is operating off of self-preservation and dominance in order to assert its sense of self and have some kind of validation for its sense of self. And because of this happens on like Russian dolls. Like there are bigger versions of this happening in the world and smaller versions of this happening in the world. And so the biggest version of this are the governments, the central banks, and the corporations. These are just giant egos that assert that identify themselves to be the ego, number one, the sense of self, and then in turn think that that sense of self is the self, and it does anything to preserve itself, and not only to preserve itself, but to dominate others, because it knows that if it's going by those rules, then other egos are going by those rules, and those egos, it will not allow those egos to dominate it, so it will try to beat those other egos to the punch by dominating them in some form or fashion. It may be physical, which is, if we want to talk about it on the large scale, it could be war, which war is an illusion too, because you have the same entities funding both sides of this war, or all sides of the war. It could be, psychological operations, making the quote unquote enemy, which is not really an enemy at all, because again, you have the same entities funding all sides, making one of the egos appear stronger in the minds of its enemy, and therefore weakening them, right? Weakening them psychologically, weakening their mindset, so that when the conqueror comes in, it's almost like there doesn't even need to be a physical war. And this is happening right now in all the countries of the world, this psychological operation. The psychological operations are superior once you've established some form of dominance, though. But usually psychological operations are the superior of the two. The physical only comes in when, honestly, it's like when you want to create fear in the people. But you can do that on the psychological level as well. So, we're talking about freedom. Freedom ultimately, because this is the case, no one can actually be free if they believe that that their sense of self is the self. No one can actually be free. This is something that will constantly enslave you. Your own belief that the sense of self is the self will enslave you. You will be enslaved into a life of self-preservation and dominance. It's just that simple. And even for those egos that don't know how to dominate others very well, the fight and self-preservation and dominance goes on within their own psychology. And we can talk about that another time. But you can never truly be free. And people don't understand or don't truly appreciate the scale on which this self-preservation and dominance actually happens. A lot of people like to think they're so smart because they know how to survive. But just knowing how to survive isn't smart, because you're still stressed out. You're deregulating your own genetic expression by being stressed all the time. It's like, this is science. So you're not really that smart. Survival shouldn't be something that you should be super, meaning you shouldn't be given a fucking medal because you survived. If you're given a fucking medal because you survived, you live in a war zone. And again, you living in a war zone is an expression of this realm being an ego reality. It's that simple. The sense of self is mistaken to be the self. So, freedom can never be had in this kind of society, in this kind of realm. Ever. Never. Governments will talk about freedom, but it's only for self-preservation and dominance. To dominate your mind and to preserve itself. And usually self-preservation and dominance go hand in hand, especially with a conqueror mentality. The more I dominate, the more that I can survive, the more I can preserve myself. So freedom can never be had. The only way that freedom can truly be had is to forego the sense of self as being the self. And we'll elaborate on that in part 2 of this podcast. Thank you. Peace.
Thanks, guys, for listening and supporting the podcast. And as always, if you're seeing this on YouTube, subscribe, hit the bell, watch a few more videos, and check out my podcast on Apple, Google, Anchor, wherever you can find it. Peace.